It is a beautiful day to apply some logic and confess the truth. I'm Megan Steele, and this is Confessions of a School Nurse. Welcome to episode 12. Thank you so much for joining me here today. We are going to take a deep dive into some crimes that were committed by nurses during the Holocaust. Last week, we kind of did a brief overview of what the Nuremberg trials were and why knowing the history is so important for us today. And then next week, we're going to dive into the specific medical ethics that we have in place today because of the Holocaust. Okay, well, we're supposed to have in place today, but we're kind of thrown out the window due to COVID. So we need to bring those back, right? We need to make Nuremberg great again. And so today, I want to let you know of very specific things that nurses were involved with during COVID. I need to start with a story that happened just a couple years ago to a student that I cared for. The story is heartbreaking. It still makes me very angry to talk about it because I can't believe that a nurse would do such a thing. This student had a mother who had early onset dementia. And this student was only able to see his mom from a window during COVID. And because she lived in a nursing facility. And finally, the day came that the student was going to get to see his mom. He was going to get that hug that he had been longing for. It had been over a year since this young man, still in high school, was able to finally get a hug from his mom. And when he got to the facility to get that hug from his mom that he's been longing for, he had to wear 2 masks, and so did everyone else around. And then they get to her room, and there was a nurse that stood at this patient's door to prevent this child from hugging his mother. They had to stay 6 feet apart. This child was longing to have a mother's touch, and they had to stay 6 feet apart because, heavens forbid, germs were shared. Heavens forbid that COVID was shared between the two of them that are double masked and everybody else is double masked. Aren't masks supposed to work? Isn't that what they said, right? Trust the science. It just, I can't understand what that nurse who stood at that door. You do not deserve to be a nurse, because if you were a nurse, you would never, ever do that to a child, let alone a person who is losing their brain due to dementia. That is absolutely ridiculous and crazy and uncalled for. Absolutely uncalled for. And I know that you might be thinking, what does this have to do with the Holocaust? But remember, all of the stuff that happened during COVID, right? Remember, it was all in the name of science. And it sounds very eerily close to what happened in Germany at the Roswitz. I know I probably totally mispronounced that, but there was a hospital there. And this sounds eerily familiar, right? This hospital was a killing site for the Nazis, but before it turned to that, it took care of those that were mentally disabled. And so at this Ravensbrück hospital, again, I'm sure I'm totally pronouncing that wrong, nurses were very obedient to doctors and to the doctor's orders. And I like to think that we as nurses are the same way, right? Like, our job is not only to provide care, right, and compassion to our patients, but we have to follow doctor's orders. We can't do certain things without doctor's orders, but we're also supposed to question doctor's orders whenever we feel like something's not right or we know that something's not right. So I guess I should start with, well, how many times have you questioned a doctor's order? Or did you actually just do it because the doctor said to, or the order was written, or put in the chart, so you just did it and you didn't question it. Well, the nurses at the Ravensbrück hospital also did the same thing, because guess what? They kept babies and children and adult patients away from their families because they were considered unworthy of life due to physical or mental disabilities. So what's the difference of that hospital in Germany doing that and this local nursing home doing the same thing? There is absolutely no difference. None. These nurses, also in Germany, back at this hospital, um, they followed doctor's orders and injected lethal doses of medications into patients. So, if that's what they did in Germany, what about the nurses in American hospitals that tied their patients down, put them on a ventilator, gave them medications like remdesivir, and waited for them to die? You may think this is a harsh comparison, but it's not, because that's exactly what happened during COVID. Nurses knew these drugs were ineffective and were killing patients, and they continued to do the same thing over and over and over and over again because it was ordered. It was ordered. They didn't question, and the nurses knew this in Germany, and they didn't question either. They did it because it was ordered, right? The only thing different is the German nurses were under the control of the Nazis. But I guess I really don't see a difference, because it seems like the American nurses are under control of a sold out government and a pharmaceutical industry. A survivor of this hospital in Germany said that during the trial, this was said during the Nuremberg trials, and quote, "The German nurses never had any professional activity. They looked on the misery of the sick with the greatest indifference and even sarcasm, and never made any effort whatsoever to help them, even though it was possible for them to do so." End quote. And I feel like nurses were in the same position during COVID, right? Like, they just did what they were supposed to do. They needed a job. They were scared for their job. So they just did what they had to do. They looked down on all these people, especially those that were unmasked and unvaxxed. They didn't care for them. I know that at this hospital, also in Germany, human experiments were being undertaken. The nurses and doctors created wounds on these patients, and then they infected these wounds with glass or sawdust and wood. And then they would study the decay and how these wounds decayed over time. So imagine having a physical or mental disability, and then somebody putting a wound on you and then infecting this wound and then not treating this wound, is all in the name of science, just to see what happened. Obviously, consent was not received for these people, and that's a huge issue, and why we have consent so much today. Hadamar was another hospital in Germany, but it also turned into a killing site for doctors and nurses as they tested different ways to kill people at this facility. And then they would take these practices that they learned and use them in the concentration camps. So this program at the Hadamar Hospital, it was led by both men and women nurses, and it led to the murder of roughly 250,000 of the most vulnerable members of the German and Austrian populations. Most of them, non-Jews, were put to death with carbon monoxide gas, lethal injection, or starvation. And then of those 250,000, about 10,000 of them were children. The Nazi dictatorship deemed that their lives were unworthy to live due to racial and financial burdens on the German nation. Other hospitals in Germany, as well as the concentration camps, the nurses falsely imprisoned people by applying restraints to prisoners for long periods of time for absolutely no reason. They administered lethal doses of medication. They frequently beat prisoners. They starved prisoners. And they deliberately refused them needed and life-saving medication. They also took part in experiments on these patients, and experiments included testing the effects of different things such as poisons, freezing and hypothermia experiments, infectious disease experiments. So they would take infectious disease, they would infect the patients and then not treat them and watch them suffer to see, would this child suffer more than this adult or anything like that. These participants were often subjected to extreme suffering, and obviously they had no informed consent. Forced sterilization on both men and women was performed by students and not doctors. Joseph Mengele, if you haven't heard about him, he is an evil, evil, cruel man. I would recommend doing some reading on him. The things that he did to people during the Holocaust times was horrific. He utilized nurses to carry out his cruel experiments. And one of the types of experiments that he did was he experimented on twins. And this kind of hits close home for me because I have twins. But in Auschwitz, he experimented on twins. And the type of experiments he did resulted in a numerous amount of them dying. The Nazi doctors also exposed prisoners to ionizing radiation. Obviously, that was not medically needed. This led to severe injuries and death. And then some Nazi doctors conducted experiments involving the removal of organs from living prisoners without anesthesia, which then would result in their death, or they would become infected and then they would die. And they did this for organ harvesting. So organ harvesting is something, if you know anything about history, that's been going on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But during the Nazi time, it was almost a prized possession to have harvested organs. And so a lot of prisoners' organs were harvested, especially prisoners of war that were soldiers, because it was like an honor thing to have their organs. Cruel and unusual, yes. I do want to say that not all German nurses were bad, right? Like, I am not implying that at all. And I am not implying that all American nurses are bad. I'm not. There are good nurses and there are bad nurses, right? There are good teachers, there are bad teachers. There are good parents and bad parents, right? I'm not generalizing that all German nurses were bad. I'm just saying that this was a group of nurses that were practicing illegally and unethically. And there are nurses today that are on the wrong side, and there are nurses that are on the right side. I want you to remember that quote that I read last week from the Nuremberg trials book. Let me grab that quote from you because it's heartbreaking. I honestly don't remember which one I marked that. Here it is. The children were thrown into the crematory ovens alive, and the crematory ditches alive without asphyxiation with gas. And their cries could be heard all over the concentration camps. And while I'm just on a roll of nurses doing bad things, what is the difference of those nurses at those concentration camps doing that with children born alive and those that are aborting babies and not helping babies born alive during a botched abortion? What is the difference? There's not a difference. So therefore, we have the same thing happening today that took place in the concentration camps at the Holocaust. There is absolutely no difference. None. And if this makes you mad and sends chills up your spine, it needs to, because you need to be awakened to what is going on. There are nurses doing the same thing today that they were tried for crimes during the Nuremberg time. We have a Holocaust going on right under our noses. And we are all too comfortable with just being where we are and are not willing to stand up and fight for our children. I want to know how many nurses administered experimental vaccines against their best judgment. How many of those patients that you administered them to now have lasting negative side effects or potentially have even died? How many of you didn't administer life-saving medications like ivermectin or basic vitamins to patients? Did you not administer because there were no orders that had you to administer when you knew that they were not going to work to begin with? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that repeated administration of medications that keep resulting in patient deaths doesn't make sense. You have to apply basic logic. You knew it was wrong and you didn't stand then, so you must stand now. Nurses, please, please, please stand now. Stand for the truth. Our profession is sacred and must always be guided by a strong and ethical compass. We do not want horrible things to happen again. Nazi doctors and nurses conducted horrific experiments on prisoners. They carried out mass sterilizations and participated in the systematic murder of millions of people. And we cannot let that happen for a third time. Yes, a third time, because the first one was the Holocaust. The second one was this pandemic that we had going on. And now we potentially have a third one. But you have to stand and you have to say no more. Another interesting side to this whole thing that's going on right now, and that I can see both sides of because I am involved in school nursing and I am involved in higher education. This is the same thing that happened back in the late 1920s and in the 1930s. Education that was given to nurses was primarily done by German physicians, right? They had oversight of these nursing programs. Yes, that's not how nursing programs are today, but just hang with me and you're going to see the correlation. During the late 20s and the early 30s, it is estimated that about 45% of physicians were members of the Nazi Party. So 45% of all the physicians were members of the Nazi Party, and the German physicians had oversight of the nursing school. So do you see where I'm going with that? Right? They championed racial hygiene and Nazi ideology, and so it infiltrated into the nursing education. Several nursing organizations existed at this time, but they weren't unified. They didn't have a central organization that united them to have a united front and say, no, this is wrong or this is unethical. So individual nurses, while there were good nurses and some did refuse to honor these policies and participate in the killing of patients, one person doing it here and one person doing there, it didn't add up very much. But if they all would have grouped together, that could have been a big, massive change, right? Because then doctors were going to have to carry out these things. And I think all of us can say we know damn well that doctors don't carry out their own orders, right? They depend on us nurses to do that. Can I get an amen to that? Social and economic and political pressures existed during the Nazi time, obviously. And similarly today, social, economic, and political pressures are changing the way that we teach. It's violating personal and professional values, to be quite honest, right? We can't define a male or a female. We're told to hate white people and that white people need to hate black people. And we're told to sit down and shut up if we use common sense and apply logic. What will the nursing profession be like in 10 years with the current way that education systems are going? Think about this for a moment. A nurse that graduated in 1932 was killing and torturing patients in 1942. So will your nurse in 10 years know the difference between a male and a female? Will your nurse be able to tell if you're truly pregnant or not? Will your nurse try to have your husband breastfeed your baby instead of you? Will your nurse be worried about calling you a they, them, or a knee, nigh, knee, ho, whatever it is? Or will your nurse give you a vaccine against your will? Will your nurse give you a medication she or he knows has killed lots of other patients but continue to give it to you because it's an order? Will you refuse to treat me because I am not vaccinated? Will you refuse to treat me because I refuse to wear a mask? Or will you be the hand of Jesus and touch those that need healed? Will you be the hand of Jesus and touch those that need help? Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today. I challenge you to pray. I need you to pray so that you have the full armor of God, so that you can stand against the medical tyranny that is overtaking our children. Our children need you. They need us to band together and fight for them because they're unable to do it by themselves. For heaven's sake, they're children. All right. So pray to have the full armor of God so that way you can stand for the truth and stand for the children. Next week, we're going to go through the actual Nuremberg Code and what that means for the nursing profession. And I hope that you have a wonderful day. Until next time, confess the tell the truth. God bless.